I'm delighted to warmly welcome you to our 2021 annual meeting. The Academy acknowledges the traditional custodians of the many lands on which our offices, on which we meet, and of all the participants around the country. I acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and they have been custodians of this land for thousands of years. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the nation's first scientists, and they remain our land's spiritual and cultural custodians. We pay our respects to elders past and present. The Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences is the nation's learned academy for the health and medical sciences, and we provide an independent voice for this sector, expert advice to decision makers, and engage with patients and the public. At the heart of our work is our fellowship, which last night became 454 fellows as we welcomed 29 new Academy fellows. The diversity of expertise amongst our fellows spans the breadth of health and medical sciences, meaning that we are uniquely positioned to address the most pressing health challenges facing society. Our vision is a future in which health and medical science, with the Academy as its champion, drive sustained improvement in the health of the Australian and the global community. The ongoing pandemic has truly demonstrated the importance of health and medical sciences and created a renewed interest from the public in these fields. Many of our fellows have been central to the contribution at both the national and international pandemic response. Others have continued working on urgent health issues that, while maybe not being front of mind for the public, still demand our assistance. Although very challenging, these past 2 years have demonstrated the important role and impact of scientists, researchers, and healthcare professionals. This year's academic scientific meeting will reflect on the intersection of research and healthcare and the lessons learned from COVID-19. We'll also look to future challenges. How can we better embed research into healthcare? How can we tackle sustainability in health? I look forward to these fascinating discussions. The annual meeting could not proceed without the contribution of many people. Firstly, I'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, CSL and Bellberry, for their support of this important event. Our fabulous program has been designed by a Canberra-based steering committee. Professor Emily Banks, head of the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at ANU, Professor Anne Kelso, CEO of the National Health and Medical Research Council, Professor Graham Mann, Director of the John Curtin School of Medical Research, Professor Kieran Kirk, Dean of the ANU College of Science, and last but certainly not least, Professor Russell Gruen, Dean of the ANU College of Health and Medicine. Now, you've noticed, no doubt, that this steering committee is based in Canberra, which is where we hope to host the meeting in person. You also note that I didn't single out one of these individuals as chair. They were a very egalitarian committee, and they have chosen to share duties equally as they put together this outstanding program. Finally, I'd like to thank the Academy's Secretariat for organising the meeting, in particular T. Boskovic, Katie Rowney, Luke Schofield, our CEO, Catherine Luckin, and until recently our interim CEO, Dr. Kath Latham. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Russell Gruen to chair the first session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. As you said, this meeting was originally to be held in Canberra, our nation's capital, and I acknowledge, celebrate and pay our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region, as well as to all First Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. Our local steering committee, Professors Anne Kelso, Emily Banks, Kieran Kirk and Graham Mann, along with the Academy Secretariat, had really looked forward to hosting you here with the magnificent spring tulips, the clear blue skies and the fresh, crisp air. But given the circumstances, we're still proud to bring you what we believe to be a program fitting of our esteemed Academy and its role in championing health and medical science, not just in our nation, but worldwide. Given all that is happening with science and health in Australia, especially as we start to emerge from lockdowns and on the eve of COP26, Canberra does seem an appropriate place for a robust and thoughtful discussion about the impact of research, the theme of this year's meeting. A couple of quick housekeeping matters. The full program with speaker biographies is available on the live stream page you're watching on now, or via the Academy's website, via the events tab. Please use our meeting hashtag for all social media posts. It's hashtag AAHMS 2021. And follow the Academy at AHMS_health on Twitter. On the right side of the video display on your screen, you'll see a Slido box where you can type in questions to the presenters and panelists and write any comments. We strongly encourage you to engage in the meeting using this chat box as much and as often as you like. It is now a great pleasure to introduce you to the first session. We are very privileged to have both Academy Fellow Professor Sharon Lewin meeting with Dr. Anthony Fauci for, as he described, a rapid-fire discussion on the impacts of research on the COVID-19 pandemic. Sharon Lewin is Professor of Infectious Diseases at the University of Melbourne, an NHMRC Practitioner Fellow, and the inaugural Director of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, which is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and Royal Melbourne Hospital. Sharon's an infectious diseases physician and a basic scientist whose research is focused on understanding why HIV persists on treatment and developing clinical trials aimed at ultimately finding a cure for HIV infection. She leads the Australian Partnership for Preparedness Research on Infectious Diseases Emergencies, a PRIZE, which is an NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence that aims to bring together Australia's leading experts in clinical, laboratory and public health research to address the key components required for a rapid and effective emergency response to infectious diseases. And her laboratory has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, the Wellcome Trust, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, and multiple commercial partnerships. Sharon has received many significant national and international awards and held many leadership roles. She was awarded the Office of the Auditor of Australia in 2019 for recognition of her distinguished service to medical research and to education and clinical care in the field of infectious diseases, especially HIV and AIDS. During the pandemic, Sharon has co-chaired the Australia National COVID-19 Health and Research Advisory Committee, and I have been privileged in my career to call her a mentor and guide. Sharon, thank you so much for being part of this first session, and I'll hand over to you to introduce the session.
Thanks so much, Russell, for the kind introduction. I'll point out it's 26 degrees here in Melbourne and a pretty nice clear blue sky as well, as unusual as that is. I too would like to start by acknowledging traditional owners of the lands on which we all are meeting and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Indigenous people here today. So I had the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Anthony Fauci for the first session. Now, over the last 20 months, Dr. Fauci has become a household name. Whether you live in San Francisco, Perth or Cape Town, everyone knows Dr. Fauci. For me personally, as an infectious diseases physician and someone very engaged with HIV research over the last 3 decades, Dr. Fauci has been a guru in the field on the basis of his own personal research and his extraordinary ability to synthesize the most complex and up-to-date science for his peers. And this is why, at the age of 80, he still remains an invited plenary speaker at almost every HIV meeting I have attended since my very first meeting when I saw him speak as an ID registrar in 1992. Overseeing the largest budget in HIV and infectious diseases research in the world of $5 billion a year, many of the advances we've seen in HIV, Ebola, influenza, and now COVID are a result of Dr. Fauci's leadership and vision. He's also widely revered as an outstanding scientific communicator. And I wanted just to take a moment to emphasize how different that is to being a scientific commentator. Over the last 20 months, we've seen a proliferation of scientific commentary in the Australian media. We've heard from surgeons commenting on public health policy, economists commenting on antigen testing, and journalists who no longer seem to need to interview experts anymore as they're suddenly sufficiently expert in every aspect of the pandemic response. Dr. Fauci couldn't be further from this. He's someone absolutely embedded in the science. He still runs his own laboratory and is deeply engaged in the thinking and analysis related to new science, strategy, and policy for infectious diseases, but particularly in virology. He openly says when he is not expert to comment, as he has repeatedly done in relation to the origin of the virus, saying that he speaks to experts such as evolutionary biologists who inform him what to say. He's an extraordinary man, a great scientist, a great leader, and an outstanding communicator. And the whole world has benefited from his vision, energy, and leadership. I hope you enjoy our discussion. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands from which we all joined this meeting. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the nation's first scientists, and they remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land. We pay our respects to elders past and present and welcome any Indigenous people here today. Well, welcome everyone to this first session of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences 2021 annual meeting. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Dr. Anthony Fauci. Now, I'm pretty confident that Dr. Fauci really needs no introduction now that he's essentially a household name. In my own world of infectious diseases, and particularly the world of HIV, Dr. Fauci has been a luminary and leading figure for literally decades. Known as a brilliant scientist, superb communicator, highly effective administrator and leader, and a man of great compassion. Dr. Fauci is the director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland, and has been in that position since 1984. He oversees an extensive research portfolio of basic and applied research related to all infectious diseases. The annual budget that he oversees at the NIAID is $5.5 billion. He's advised 7 presidents on HIV, as well as many other domestic and global health issues. He was one of the principal architects of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a program that has saved literally millions of lives throughout the developing world. He's a recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honour given to a civilian by the President of the United States, and the National Medal of Science. What many probably don't know is just how close Dr. Fauci has remained and still remains to the science. He's head of the Laboratory of Immunoregulation and leads the HIV immunopathogenesis section. His own laboratory remains one of the world's leading HIV laboratories, and I understand that despite whatever is going on, he still attends lab meetings weekly. And I find that totally inspirational. So welcome, Tony. Lovely to see you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. It's really good to be with you.
Now, you might not remember, but we were last together on a panel with the University of Melbourne's previous Dean of Medicine, Professor Kshitij Kapoor, on October the 28th, 2020, almost exactly 12 months to the day. Now, I remember that date very well because it was the day Melbourne opened up after more than 100 days of lockdown. I was going out for dinner that night, you might remember. And I also scored some great credibility in my household because you said you wouldn't mind joining us for dinner, and my sons couldn't believe it. Well, ironically, we somehow find ourselves in the identical position now in Melbourne. We've been locked down since mid-August and unable to control a Delta outbreak with even the best and most stringent public health measures. However, after a really slow start to vaccination in Australia, we're predicted, or actually we got to 70% double vaccination today, and we'll be at 70% double vaccination in Victoria in about 48 hours. And over 83% of Victorians have actually had their first vaccine. So we're very close to opening up again. It's going to happen on Thursday evening. And I hope that maybe in October 2022, I can actually see you in person. So I think this makes a really nice framing for our conversation to essentially reflect on the last 12 months, but also look forward to the future, because so much has indeed happened in the last 12 months, particularly the role that research has played to bring us to this point and how it's going to help us move forward. So first of all, I'd like to start with some reflections over the last 12 months for you. And I know, and I've read, that you've always been an athlete, a runner. I hear a walker nowadays. So what's the race been like for you over the last 12 months?
Well, Sharon, it's really been very unique when it comes to responding to infectious disease outbreaks because of the durability of it. I don't think any of us, when this all started back in the winter of 2019-2020, when we first began realizing that we were in a serious situation with the outbreak that began in China, but then spread to the rest of the world, it was sort of learning on a day-by-day, week-by-week, month-by-month basis. When we finally realized we were in for a pandemic, I don't think any of us would have realized that even getting vaccinations, which is a surprise in and of itself. I think scientifically, having gotten safe and effective vaccines within less than a year from the time that the virus was identified in January of 2020, to have safe and effective vaccines by December of that same year was unprecedented. But was also unprecedented was now we are in our 20th month of this outbreak, and it's really unusual. It is a very, very understatement that a country like Australia, with all the resources and all the scientific and public health expertise that you have, still in October of 2021 is just coming out of lockdown. I mean, who would have ever in our wildest dreams predicted that 20 months later, we were still in a situation where we had a lockdown? It's very gratifying to hear what you just said about the percentage of people that are now vaccinated and will be vaccinated in Australia, because very likely over the coming months, it will be your summer, but our winter, that you very likely are going to see a dramatic diminution in the number of cases. We would hope that that's the case. But the short answer to your question is, never would I have predicted over the last year and a half that we would have been in such a dire situation, even in the context of a safe and effective vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as many people say, COVID keeps throwing more curveballs. What did you not anticipate happening over the last 12 months? You know, when we spoke 12 months ago, the phase 3 studies were just coming out. We knew we had a number of vaccines. What did you kind of not anticipate happening over the next subsequent 12 months?
You know, I did not anticipate that we would have such an extraordinary evolution of variants, where you would have particularly the variant that we're all dealing with in a very troubling way, the Delta variant, very unusual in virology, where you have the evolution from the Wuhan strain to the B117, the alpha strain, and then you have a Delta strain, which if you look at the map of the United States, when we were in May of this past year, the year we're in now, 2021, the Delta variant occupied about 3 to 5% of the variants. Now, 99.9% of the variants are Delta. And Delta is very, very different. Different in its high degree of transmissibility, and different in the fact that even with people who are vaccinated, that although we all know that vaccines are not 100% effective, even when a vaccinated person does get infected, it is quite true that they have a much, much lesser of a chance of having a serious outcome. The fact is, when you measure the level of virus in the nasopharynx, it's very high. I mean, it's 1,000 times higher than what alpha was. So we're in this unusual situation that although vaccines certainly protect people from getting infected, it's about 5 or 6 times less likelihood, about 11 times less likelihood that you would go to a hospital or that you would die, but it still doesn't protect very well against transmission. So that even if I got infected and was perfectly asymptomatic or had mild symptoms, the level of virus in my nasopharynx would be so high that it very likely would transmit to someone else. That makes it very difficult to get complete control of an outbreak. I never would have expected that that would happen.
Do you think we might get better vaccines that can create better mucosal immunity or even sterilizing immunity? Do you see that coming?
Well, certainly we're looking for next generation vaccines. And you know, people not involved in immunology perhaps don't fully appreciate it. And that's very understandable, that when you get a vaccine that's given as an intramuscular injection, you may get good systemic protection, particularly against disease in the lung and other organ systems. But you don't get a lot of mucosal immunity. So we know that when your antibody level is very high, like by the LabCorp method, let's say 2,000 titer, that you can protect against infection. But once it goes below a certain level, you still protect against severe disease, such as involvement of the lung. But the protection against infection goes way down, particularly after a period of 4, 5, 6, 7 months. The immunity is quite waning. And we've learned a lot from our Israeli colleagues who are, you know, about a month ahead of the United States when it comes to the dynamics of the outbreak, as well as the vaccine situation. And we're seeing and we're learning a lot from them, that right now, when they're 5 or so, 6 months out, the protection against infection and severe disease with the Pfizer mRNA goes down substantially. I mean, at 6 months, it's down to 30, 40% for infection, and it goes down to around 70% or so for severe disease. So what I think is going on, Sharon, is I think we may not need better vaccines, but I think the proper regimen very likely would include a booster. A booster, I don't think, is a bonus. I think a booster may be part of the correct regimen, which we didn't know about that because we were going so fast to develop a vaccine that the 2-dose mRNA became the standard. If we had enough time to do a phase 2A or 2B study, we likely would have come to the conclusion that the optimal regimen is a 3rd boost.
Yeah. I mean, and who knows what might be needed after that. Would you predict you're going to need annual boosters, or the 3 doses might be enough?
You know, I don't know, Sharon. I have to be perfectly honest with you. I don't know. I think we're going to get some increased durability with the 3rd shot boost. I'm almost certain that we're not going to see vaccine effectiveness waning after 5 or 6 months after the third shot. But I don't think it's going to be indefinite. I think we likely would have to get boosted intermittently, maybe not every year, but likely, because the history of coronaviruses, the common cold coronaviruses that we've been exposed to, the history of that tells us that the durability of immunity is not as long as something like measles or polio or something like that.
When we last spoke, I think it was about a week before the election. And I know that for you, politics and public health has been a very big and somewhat personal issue. And I think in many ways, politics and public health can be good and bad. And you've obviously spoken widely about this. What do you think is unique to COVID? And how has politics played out differently in the response to COVID to, say, other major pandemics such as HIV?
Well, I think United States and perhaps other countries have experienced the same thing. I don't think there's anything peculiar about the virus COVID. What is peculiar and unusual to the extent of never having experienced anything like this in well over 100 years, is the intensity of the impact on a global level. We've never had this before. I mean, even the famous pandemic of 2009 of H1N1, as pandemics go, it was, really rather mild. Not a lot of deaths, a lot of transmission, but not a lot of deaths. So the stress, societal stress was minimum. When you get an intensity of societal stress in a country like the United States that is profoundly divisive politically, I've never seen anything like this. I mean, anyone who's observing what's going on in the United States right now would have to say that, comparatively speaking, for other eras in the United States, this is really unique, where you have divisiveness, not just ideological differences, but really profound divisiveness, where reality and truth are normal, are no longer normal. Lies become normalized. I mean, people actually walk around confident, saying things that either did not happen or they did happen and they deny that they happened. I mean, I look back on the history of my country and I don't think there's anything like this has been comparable. I mean, denial that the president won the election. I mean, when did we ever have anything like that? An assault on the seat of our democracy, an assault, violent assault on the Capitol, and then people acting like it never happened. That's very unusual, Sharon. Very unusual.
I can definitely see that. Of course, I think the misinformation, battling social media around misinformation. I mean, we've been watching how vaccinations are plateauing in the US and still with infections and deaths in the unvaccinated. Are you optimistic that that you'll be able to push up the rates of vaccination despite the misinformation?
Well, I hope so. We have in our country has 328 million people. There are about 66 million people who are eligible to be vaccinated, who have not gotten vaccinated. Some of them are won over when you get trusted messengers to try and convince them how important it is to get vaccinated. Some have responded to the mandates where it's required to be vaccinated unless you want to get into a university or to a college or to a job. But even with that, we still have a core of recalcitrant people who just do not want to get vaccinated, which really is stunning, Sharon, because you have a virus. Just take my country as one example, where we've had 45 million infections and 750,000 deaths. That's unprecedented. And yet, even with that, you still have people who don't want to get vaccinated. And when you look at the statistics, 90+% of the people who've died, 96% of the people who've died of COVID-19 were unvaccinated. I mean, those data stare you right in the face. How can you walk away from some stunning data and say, I still don't want to get vaccinated? It's inexplicable. It really is.
Yeah, so much more powerful messaging out there that we just can't compete with. But I want to talk. I mean, the US public health and political response has been really challenging, but the scientific response has just been stunning. And so I want to talk about the positives here. And you've spent decades building capacity in the US and globally, really, in response to HIV. Do you want to talk a bit about the impact of that investment on COVID? Because I can see some very direct impacts on how things moved with COVID.
Well, Sharon, it's a beautiful story that I know warms your heart as a scientist that you are, and the fact that you and I have been doing basic and clinical research for years and you don't see the immediate effect of it. And then all of a sudden something comes along and you realize how that investment and why that investment was so important. If you look at it from two standpoints, the high unprecedented success of the COVID-19 vaccines, it came from two avenues. The first was the development of extraordinary platforms for vaccine. That goes back 15 to 20 years, starting with someone who was a fellow in my lab, Drew Weissman, for many years. So Drew was always interested in developing vaccines, and he partnered up with Katie Carrico, and they worked for years on something that many people didn't pay any attention to. And by some brilliant basic research of manipulating the molecule of RNA so that it wouldn't trigger an innate immune response, they came up with an extraordinary new vaccine platform, mRNA. On the other side of the coin, and this is where you and I should take some pleasure, because it was the research on HIV using structure-based vaccine design with cryo-EM to get the right conformation of the stabilized envelope trimer in order to induce broadly neutralizing antibodies. We weren't successful in developing an HIV vaccine, but that same approach of using structure-based vaccine design to get the right conformation of the spike protein stabilized with mutations that were developed years earlier to get the right stabilized pre-fusion conformation. You put both of those together, the work of Barney Graham and Kizzmekia Corbett and Jason McClellan and Andrew Ward, together with the work of Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman, you put them together and you have an incredible vaccine that's being used throughout the world right now. And it's very interesting how that started. I don't think people fully realize that the vaccine work that had been done with HIV, as unsuccessful thus far that's been, was the key to the success of the immunogen for COVID-19.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant story, and a brilliant story about the importance of investment in basic research. And in many ways, the antibody story is probably similar. A lot of the technologies to identify broadly neutralizing antibodies in HIV has also, and again, your Vaccine Research Centre at the NIH has played a major role in identifying those COVID antibodies, which also look quite promising, even though treatments have really lagged behind in COVID. The other good news story, of course, is thinking about the future. And the Biden administration, I hear, recently announced a $65 billion proposal to remake the nation's pandemic preparedness infrastructure. It's been likened to the Apollo program of the late 1960s, and the scale of the investment is quite extraordinary. Can you tell us a bit more about what's being planned?
Well, here it is. Yeah, this is the American Pandemic Preparedness Transforming Our Capabilities. And you're absolutely correct, Sharon. It is a proposal for $65 billion over 10 years to do everything from what we've just been speaking of, the fundamental basic clinical research infrastructure that led to the successful COVID-19 vaccines and to the monoclonal antibodies, to really reinventing and re-strengthening our local public health infrastructure. One of the things you may not have fully appreciated or realized was how we stumbled in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, because our ability to identify, isolate, and contact trace, which we thought was really good, turned out to be not so good. So it's building up of the infrastructure. Also, it's developing a coordinated approach from a global international standpoint, so that you have a global health security network of transparency and communication, so that when something happens, it doesn't take a long time to fully realize. The other is to create something that I'm very excited about, because it goes over into the arena of immunology and virology, and that is to develop what's called a prototype pathogen approach, where instead of waiting for a particular pathogen to emerge, you study all families of pathogens and you determine the commonalities of the coronavirus family, the alpha virus, the arenovirus, those viruses, and you figure out what you can do to get the commonality and make, for example, a phase 1 study on a universal arenavirus or alpha virus or coronavirus, and you have it ready to go, with the goal being 100 days from the time a new pathogen emerges that you actually have a vaccine that you could start distributing. Now, that may seem impossible, but if you look at what we did with COVID-19, when on January 9th we had the sequence and we started a vaccine development, 65 days later, we were in a phase 1 trial, 65 days later. So if we can go from that to get a vaccine ready to go in 100 days, that would transform from a global standpoint, not only from the United States, how efficiently and quickly we can respond to a new emerging outbreak.
I think part of the plan is that within 200 days, every person on the planet would have access to it. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. But you got to get to the 100 days first.
It's true, except that, what we've seen is we've got great vaccines but can't get them to people. And that's also been a real weakness. So, and that I was going to ask you a bit about COVAX and how we're going to solve that problem, less than 3% of Africa being vaccinated.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea, COVAX, and I think it's ultimately going to be successful. But right now, you're absolutely right. It is not that we don't have enough vaccines. We're not getting them into the arms of people. I mean, we still need billions of doses. I don't want to walk away from that. That's true. But even with the doses that we have, we're not efficiently getting them into the arms of people who need them. So we really need to improve the supply chain integrity to be able to get those vaccines. And then also we really need to, and the United States is doing this, we need to make investments of billions of dollars to increase the capacity of companies like Pfizer and Moderna and those companies that actually make the doses, because they're making a lot, but they're not yet making enough for the whole world. And that's what we've got to do. If you get an outbreak of intense as this outbreak is, you really have got to be able to make sure that the entire world has access, not just rich countries. And I think you mentioned it a moment ago, Sharon. If you look at the percentage of people who've received at least 1 dose of vaccine in South America, the European Union, Australia, the United States, it's looking pretty good. But when you get down to certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it's like as low as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%. I mean, compared to the 70 and 80% in Australia and the 65 to 70% in the United States, that is unacceptable, that Africa should be so far behind.
Absolutely, got a really long way to go. And I wonder whether, you know, the manufacturing capacity actually probably has to be devolved as well across the world. I've only got a few minutes left, and I'd really love to have a few personal reflections from you, if that's okay.
Sure.
I mean, you've been an absolute inspiration to so many people for decades, as I said at the beginning, but particularly over the last 20 months. So I'd like to ask what inspires you, or who inspires you, and what does great leadership look like?
Well, what inspires me, Sharon, is the enormity of the problem and the responsibility that we in public health and science have assumed a responsibility where the lives and the health of so many people depend upon what you and I do. So, I mean, when you have some kind of burden of responsibility, you've got to take it really seriously. So I get inspired by two things. I get inspired by the responsibility that has been put upon us, but I also get inspired by the local public health people, the nurses and the doctors who are out there knocking themselves out to take care of so many sick people, that we're kind of the backup to them, giving them the tools that they need to address this. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that gives me a lot of energy. I mean, people say, how the heck can you possibly keep going for 20 months like this? You know, you don't burn out because the problem is too important. You can't allow yourself to do that. The time will come when we can sit back and reflect on this, but that time is not now. So that's the thing that really keeps me going.
What does great leadership look like to you?
You know, to me, great leadership is example. To be a leader, you have to absolutely be the person that people look up to. You've got to clearly articulate the goals of where you want to go so that there's no doubt in anybody's mind what the task is. I think one of the failings of some leaders is that the people that they supposedly are leading are not very clear where we're going. So if you're a leader, you've got to make it absolutely clear, this is where we're going and here is how we're going to get there. You give the people that you're leading a good degree of leeway. You don't want to micromanage. A good leader doesn't micromanage. A good leader sets the vision, sets the example, and is a consistent person so that people know exactly where you're going and why you're going there. To me, that's what leadership looks like.
Yeah, and you've done it absolutely brilliantly over the last 5 decades at the NIH. My last question, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but we all know that you turned 80 last December, I think, Christmas Eve. Most people at your age are retired or thinking about retirement, but you're more active than ever. So what's your secret and what's the issue that you can't leave unsolved?
Well, the secret, I think, Sharon, is also the answer to your second question. It's unfinished business. You know, 40 years ago, I started off with HIV when I saw my first patient right across the lawn from where I'm sitting now, here on NIH campus. And we still have unfinished business with HIV. I mean, I don't think I'm going to be around when we completely nail it down, because I don't think that's going to happen in the next couple of years. But I would really like to see a real turnaround in the number of cases per year, that where we get out of the epidemic stage and we get into more of a stage of control. Certainly, I'm not going anywhere until we get COVID-19 under control. I mean, that to me is unthinkable that I would ever think of moving away from this until we have this outbreak under control. So the answer to your question is that we have unfinished business. So I think I'm going to be in Australia having dinner with you in a year or so.
We'll still plan that. Well, look, thank you so much, Tony. I know you've been an inspiration to so many people, but I'm sure to all the fellows of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences that are listening in, thanks for everything that you've done over your career, but particularly for HIV and also the last 20 months in COVID. And wish you every success. And yes, we will have dinner somewhere in 2022, I hope. Thanks
Thank
very
you
much.
very much. Thank you very much, Sharon. As always, it's a great pleasure to be with you. So take care of yourself. I hope to see you soon in person.
Wow. Well, thanks to Professor Lewin and Dr. Fauci for an amazing interview. I welcome everybody's comments and feedback in the Slido chat box. I appreciate Ross and John and Hugh, your contributions already. I might make a few of my own comments and reflections about the interview, if I may. Firstly, really inspired with the great comments about research leadership and development. And I think both Sharon and Dr. Fauci provide great role models of what effective leaders in science and health and medicine with global impact are, and we should all take great notice. Secondly, there's obviously a lot about rapid evolution requiring rapid science. The virus changing, the science changing, and the global scientific community rising to the challenge. Some ways represented by shortening from many years to a matter of months the time it takes from first sequencing a new pathogen to when an effective vaccine is rolled out. They talked about the extraordinary interplay and interdependence of science, politics, and public sentiment, and how these things manifest in things as important as the willingness of our public to get vaccinated. They talked about how much we learn and advance science through real world situations. And I guess there's nothing like trying to navigate a true disaster to learn about how to do it better next time. And in that regard, it's really impressive to have the US thinking big about the future and the importance that the nation has put on building on their experience through a $65 billion 10-year national pandemic preparedness plan. As was highlighted in the chat, the importance that the pandemic and the science has placed on accepting the fact that we're all part of a connected, interdependent global community in which we all have a stake in addressing not just overall vaccination rates, but also especially in addressing inequality of access to vaccines. It's highlighted for us the importance of respecting truth and fact, and whether indeed there can be shades and versions of truth and fact, whether they are relative or absolute concepts. And as a related concept, they highlighted what professional expertise means in a time when it seems that everyone's an epidemiologist. It's great that so many people now know what an epidemiologist is and can even say the word and understand the importance of their work. But it's also shone a light on what it is and is not to be an expert in epidemiology. These are great segues into the next session of the program. And I'll introduce that in just a few moments, but let's just reflect on what else has come up in the chat. So John Myberg talked about vaccine inequality. Thanks, John. Sharad Kumar, brilliant start to the meeting. Thank you to both Dr. Fauci and Sharon Lewin. That's come up a few times, and I agree that it was an absolutely superb interview. What can we say as an academy to further advocate for vaccines to be made available to developing countries? A great question for us to mull on for the rest of this meeting and beyond. And what a great start to a conference like this. Are there things we can learn from the responses in the US to avoid and deal with similar responses here? And I think we are all reflecting on that and trying to learn lessons, not just from our own nation, but how do we learn lessons from all that's happening across the world in real time and often very rapidly. From Dr. Fauci's comments, it seems a booster is required 6 months after the Pfizer vaccination. Why isn't this being recommended by ATAGI? And I haven't got the answer to that question, but that may well come up in the rest of the conference proceedings. So perhaps now, I think that all provides a great segue into the next session of the program. And for the next hour, we focus on what evidence does matter most for effective control of COVID-19. We will have a keynote address from a veteran of infectious disease outbreaks, and then a panel discussion to unpack the role that different types of evidence play in advancing our understanding of the disease and what works in responding to it. And ultimately, how we can best foster an integrated scientific understanding of all relevant types of knowledge and use that understanding to advance the human condition.